Well, Matthew chapter 23. I saw a very good Facebook post just this week, a quote from Paul Washer saying, "You can't really complain about wearing a mask in church. You've been doing it for years." And here is Jesus unmasking the Pharisees and the experts in the law, the teachers of the law, the scribes. They were experts at pretending to be one thing while they were really another, acting a part. That's how this word, the word hypocrite comes from Greek. It meant originally making a speech, and then it became making a speech while acting a part. These were people who were acting a part, pretending to be one thing while they were another. Well, Jesus here unmasks them with these repeated woes. And we see Jesus in that respect in the course of the Old Testament prophets. You can see in Isaiah chapter 5, Isaiah pronounces a number of woes upon people. In Habakkuk chapter 2, you can read Habakkuk's woes. Well, Jesus is in the line of the prophets pronouncing woe. In Greek, it's made up of 4 vowels, this word. It's O-U-A-I, which I think is a bit of a Geordie word. Ooh-I man. But it's an expression of distress, of anger, of grief. Some translate it as alas. Alas. It's a warning, certainly. Jesus is warning these people that if they don't sort things out, that they are in real trouble. Some suggest it's a pronouncement of a curse. I'm not quite sure it is. It's a warning that if they don't repent and change, then they are in serious trouble. I think there are 7 woes, as the NIV has. Some of the versions at verse 14, you'll notice, is missing in the NIV list of verses. It's there in the as a footnote. Verse 14 is omitted from the earlier Greek manuscripts, the earlier versions in other languages, and the earlier writers from the church who commentated on Matthew or wrote about Matthew 13. It's omitted from those. I think it's brought over from Mark and Luke, who have it directly after the questions that Jesus is asked in Matthew 22. At the end of those questions, in Mark and Luke, you have the comment about the Pharisees devouring widows' houses and making a show of lengthy prayers. I think it's been brought over from there. And it's interesting that almost all the manuscripts that do include it actually have it before verse 13, not after it. So I think it's proper to omit it. The same truth is there in Mark and Luke. We're not losing it altogether, but there are 7 woes that Jesus pronounces. Well, let's explore them together. First of all, the woe that they are bad bouncers. You know, bouncers are those who stand outside a venue to decide who comes in and who's allowed access. Well, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they are bad bouncers. They shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. How did they shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces? Well, surely it was by their rejection of the Lord Jesus. He is the door, but they rejected Jesus, the only way in, and they turned other people away from Jesus. You see that, for instance, in John chapter 7, when the Pharisees had dispatched the temple guard to arrest Jesus. In John 7 and verse 45, we read, "Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and Pharisees, who asked them, 'Why didn't you bring him in?' 'No one ever spoke the way this man does,' the guards declared. 'You mean he has deceived you also?' the Pharisees retorted. 'Has any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him?' 'No.' But this mob that knows nothing of the law, there is a curse on them. They didn't believe in Jesus. They rejected him and his claims. But not only that, they also turned others away from Jesus. And so that's clear across in John chapter 9, after the healing of the man born blind. You remember the Pharisees interrogate the man that was born blind. And it says in John 9, verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." He can't be God's man. He breaks the Sabbath. And then in verse 22 of that chapter, John 9, the blind man's parents are interrogated as well. His parents said this. They said that the blind man, he is our son. We don't know how he got well. He's of age, ask him. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That's how they shut the door. They didn't go in themselves, and they shut the door to others, turning people away from trusting in Jesus. It was a pretended concern for men's souls, but it was only a pretense. And surely the danger here that Jesus is warning against is thinking that it's our way or no way. It's our way or no way. And it was interesting reading, I mentioned George Verwer's book that I received, just a package of books. And in one of those, he warns repeatedly against a narrow way of thinking that people can only be saved our way. And we have to be generous and acknowledge that God does things in ways we don't expect. The Pharisees weren't expecting the Messiah to be in the shape of Jesus. And so that's why they were against it and against him. Well, we have to acknowledge that God has his own ways of working, and it's not our way or no way, it's God's way. And so Jesus pronounces this woe on the Pharisees for being bad bouncers, not entering themselves and turning others away, because they thought they were the sole people who could decide what was the way into God's kingdom, not realizing that God's ways are above our ways. They were bad bouncers. They were misguided missionaries. In verse 15, you travel over land and sea to win a single convert. When he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Jesus is not mincing his words here. I think that's a proverbial saying when he says that you travel land and sea to win a single convert. It's a proverbial saying about effort and zeal. I don't think the Pharisees were actually missionaries traveling across the world. He's speaking of their effort and zeal to win people. And in winning them, very often we see, don't we, even today, in terms of converts to Islam, that they are more extreme than the other adherents. Those who are converts are often more extreme. I think that's the sense that Jesus is saying here. You make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. They are more bigoted, the converts. They are more hardened in their opinions. And then again, it's important to notice that these Pharisees, the teachers of the law, it was not so much about winning people to God as winning people to their sect, to be part of their club, part of their group. That's what they were about. It wasn't really winning people to God. It was winning people to their sect. The danger is sectarianism, is that it's being, you've got to be part of our group. You've got to see things the way we do, and forcing people into a mold, again, failing to recognize that God's ways were above theirs, and God moved in a different way than they anticipated and taught. They were misguided missionaries because they weren't seeking to win people to God. They were seeking to win people to their sect, to their group. And there's a danger for us, just as it was. It's our way or no way. It's our group or no group. No, we've got to be generous. And we've got our endeavors have got to be to win people to God. If they don't join our group, well, that's in the Lord's hands. We've got to be those seeking not to be sectarian, but to be generous in our endeavors. They were bad bouncers, misguided missionaries, and they provided loopholes for lies. Verses 16 to 22, this passage about oaths and what oaths were valid and which oaths you weren't obliged to keep. And that's what they did by these clever distinctions they made between whether it was the temple or the gold of the temple, whether it was the altar or the thin offer. If you swore by certain things, you had to do what you'd sworn. If you swore by other things, then you weren't obliged to do it. You see how it's a loopholes for dishonesty. That's what they were providing. Loopholes for lies, loopholes for dishonesty. And it's interesting here that Jesus doesn't refer to them as hypocrites, but as blind. Verse 16, woe to you, blind guides. Verse 17, you blind fools. Verse 19, you blind men. That they couldn't see the folly of their own thinking, which he exposes by how he counteracts what they've been teaching, that it's the temple is obviously greater than the gold, the altar is obviously greater than the gift that's sacrificed on it, and that all swearing is to be kept and honoured. There's to be no duplicity and insincerity. And so Jesus exposes these loopholes for lies. That's what it was ultimately, loopholes for lies, that they, by their clever distinctions, were encouraging people in insincerity. It's really a warning against lessening the seriousness of dishonesty. That's what this is a warning about, that dishonesty, duplicity, not meaning what we say, is a serious business. And these Pharisees and teachers of the law were guilty of lessening the seriousness of dishonesty and allowing people to not truly mean what they were saying. Loopholes for lies. And then in verses 23 to 24, Jesus speaks about their dromedary diet. Sorry about the alliteration there. The dromedary diet. They were swallowing camels while they strained at gnats. So it's a very good ironic picture, isn't it? Jesus, very carefully they are straining out any tiny little pollutants that might have got in their liquid and straining out those tiny little gnats while they're swallowing a camel down whole in their diet. Well, it's clear what Jesus is speaking about is this scrupulous exactness and precision in obedience to the law on tithing, while neglecting the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. So you give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. Well, it's a challenge to reckon you're a tenth of those. These are very lightweight spices. They have their various little measures, and they would very carefully measure out a tenth of their supply and make that as their tithe to the temple and to those who worked in the temple, while they neglected these more important matters. Jesus has already spoken to the Pharisees about these matters back in chapter chapter 9 of Matthew's Gospel. Chapter 9 and verse 10. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." Again, in chapter 12, when the disciples are walking through the cornfields and plucking ears of corn, the Pharisees find fault. And again, Jesus says in verse 7, if you had known what these words means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. So Jesus has already been highlighted them the preeminence of mercy. They were very concerned about their certain rules and regulations. Jesus said there's something more important, mercy. And it's a reminder that Jesus, in regards as the law, saw that the moral law had precedence, was more important than the ceremonial law, the civil law. Jesus highlighted the importance, the supremacy of the moral law in terms of matters like justice or righteousness, mercy, and faithfulness. They are the more important matters. Yes, the other things are not to be completely neglected. You're not to have forgotten all about your tithing, but you have to get things in perspective and ensure that you concentrate on the major things rather than the minor things. And there's a danger. Again, this is a warning that Jesus is proclaiming. And notice, I forgot to mention back in verse 1 of chapter 23, Jesus is not just speaking to the Pharisees and the scribes here. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples. So here's a warning. This is what they're like. Don't get like them. You've got to beware of majoring on minors while you neglect the majors. No, keep the main thing the main thing. And there's a danger that we're to avoid in majoring on minors. Making less important things the most important things, and neglecting those far more important matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And then Jesus speaks about dirty dishes. They've got a very strange method of washing up the Pharisees. You know what Jesus says? You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. All they cleaned was the outside of the things that they were eating from. They never cleaned the inside. Well, who would do that? And this is what Jesus is exposing, that they were only concerned with externals. The inner attitude was left untouched. You clean the outside, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. And again, these are very strong words that Jesus uses in condemning the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. Greed is actually the word that's used elsewhere of robbery, of grabbing what isn't yours. It's robbery, stealing. And self-indulgence is literally having no control. Perhaps the nearest English word is incontinence. And it really means no self-control. That's why it's self-indulgence. Some of the other versions have excess. There's no control. They just give themselves in excess. We know, so this greed, this robbery, this love of money, in Luke 16, we're told that the Pharisees were lovers of money. In Luke 16 and verse 14, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus, who said, you cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot serve God and money. In Luke 16, verse 13 and 14, the Pharisees, they loved money. They made a fine appearance on the outside, but their inner motivation was the love of money. And that's perhaps where that reference to devouring widows' houses come in, that they were out to grab whatever was left from these wealthy widows. They befriended them, they made a show of religion in order to profit from the will of those widows. They failed to deal with attitude and motivation. And there's a danger that we can concentrate on the externals of behavior and not deal with the attitude and motivation behind it. And that's no way to get clean. Cleanliness comes from dealing with the attitude and the motivation inside, not just the actions outside. Yes, if you deal with your attitude and motivation, that will have an impact on your behavior and how you act. But we have to get to the inside and deal with that. Our attitudes and motivations need to be cleaned up by God's power and God's grace. Dirty dishes and the way to get really clean. And then the sixth woe is about corrupt corpses. Corrupt corpses in verses 27 and 28. You're like whitewashed tombs. Because of the legislation in the law of Moses regarding not contaminating yourself by dead bodies, they did whitewash the tombs in ancient Israel so that people would know where they were, so they wouldn't inadvertently contaminate themselves by contact with the dead. And so Jesus perhaps has seen these, that people know what he's referring to. They looked fine outside, but that didn't alter the contents of those tombs, which were utter corruption. Inside they are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. There was utter corruption, corrupt corpses inside. In the same way, Jesus says, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And the word Jesus uses for wickedness is actually lawlessness. You are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Well, that's the last thing we'd expect of the Pharisees, teachers of the law. Surely they were paragons of lawfulness rather than lawlessness. Surely they were keeping the law exactly. But Jesus has already, back in Matthew chapter 15, exposed their lawlessness when he was challenged about the fact that his disciples didn't wash their hands according to the tradition of the elders. Jesus says in Matthew 15 and verse 3, why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? You say, honor your father and mother. Anything that curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me as a gift devoted to God, he is not to honor his father with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition, you hypocrites. It was again, they pretended that they were lawful, but Jesus says, no, you're actually breaking God's law by your emphasis on the outward traditions that you've manufactured that actually are used to break God's law. Again, the danger, isn't it, is it's a concern for externals only. And there's a danger that we can fall into that same hypocrisy, that same mask wearing, that is a concern for externals only, not for what's inside our hearts and our lives. Jesus concludes with a woe regarding their dastardly DNA. Their dastardly DNA. They pretended regard for the prophets, and they disassociated themselves from their forefathers. If we'd have been alive then, we'd have never been part of seeing the prophets put to death. But Jesus says, no, you are thereby admitting that you are descendants of prophet slayers. It's in your spiritual DNA, is what Jesus is saying. And that becomes clear. Again, he's already spoken to them back in Matthew 21 and verse 33 onwards, the parable of the tenants, where the owner of the vineyard sends his servants to get the fruit, and the tenants mistreat them, beat them, kill them, and then he sends his son, and likewise they are intent on killing him. Jesus is exposing that they've got that same degenerate DNA. Their rejection of Jesus and their resolve to kill him shows that they've got those family traits that they're so eager to disassociate themselves from. No, you've got the same attitude. You prefer dead preachers to those who are going to expose your sin. You don't mind those who are dead and buried. You won't have preachers that speak now to your own sinfulness and your own faults. And so these woes that Jesus pronounces, they are woes spoken, as we've said, in the hearing of the crowds and his disciples. I've said before, I remember my dad often saying, don't get like 'em, son, when there were various people who are a disappointment. Don't get like 'em, son. Well, that's what Jesus is saying, surely, to his disciples, and therefore to us. Hear these woes and don't get like 'em. In the book that I was reading from George Verwer, he was recommending another book entitled Pharisectomy. A Pharisectomy, how to joyfully remove your inner Pharisee and other religiously transmitted diseases. Well, we have to heed the warning not to get like them, but perhaps we also have to go about a Pharisectomy and deal with that inner Pharisee that will adopt these attitudes, these practices, and the mask that it's so easy to wear. So as we prepare to gather again in physical meetings, don't complain about having to wear a mask. You've been doing it for years. That wonderful hymn by James Orr, search me, O God, and know my heart today. Try me, O Lord, and know my thoughts, I pray. See if there be some wicked way in me. Cleanse me from every sin and set me free. And that makes very clear that it's our hearts that need cleansing. It's our heart, the internal, that needs dealing with, not just the externals. May God grant his grace that we heed these woes and don't get like them. We're going to sing our closing hymn, Purify My Heart, Let Me Be as Gold, Precious Silver.